Under the heavy Texas sun, Morgan Reed pulled her aging Subaru off the winding county road and onto the gravel driveway that led through a line of thin mesquite trees and into a clearing. There, nestled between untamed fields and an overgrown tree line, stood the ranch house, a modest, sun-faded structure with peeling white paint and a wraparound porch that looked like it hadn't heard laughter in years. Her heart swelled at the sight. The place was a mess, but it was hers now, gifted to her in full by her former mentor and friend, Dr. Evelyn Keating. Evelyn had been a fiercely private botanist, a woman of few attachments and fewer words, who had taken Morgan under her wing during a particularly vulnerable period of Morgan's academic life. They had spent years in Evelyn's university greenhouse cataloging rare desert flora, trading long silences and rare moments of warmth like currency. When Evelyn passed suddenly from a stroke, Morgan had expected nothing more than a brief mention in her obituary. Instead, she received a sealed envelope with a handwritten note and the deed to this forgotten stretch of land. "You'll know what to do," Evelyn had scrawled in her slanted hand. Morgan didn't know what to do. Not exactly, but she knew she wanted to honor Evelyn's memory. And this land, wild and under siege by weeds, had the bones of something beautiful, something useful. Her plan was simple. Restore the greenhouse on the edge of the property, build an educational program around conservation and native plant restoration, and create the kind of sanctuary Evelyn always imagined but never had the patience to build herself. But as Morgan stepped out of the car and stretched her legs, the sound of crushed gravel behind her made her pause. A sleek golf cart rolled into view from the far end of the property, dust rising behind it like smoke. At the wheel sat a woman in a pale blue linen blouse, sunglasses perched high on her styled hair, and an expression that managed to be both condescending and concerned. She pulled up without invitation and didn't bother stepping out. "Excuse me," the woman called, her voice sharp with the distinct edge of someone long accustomed to giving instructions. "You can't be here without prior notice. This land is under HOA regulation. Are you with the landscaping crew?" Morgan blinked, caught off guard. "I'm Morgan Reed," she replied slowly, reaching into her tote bag to pull out the envelope containing the deed. "This is my property. I just arrived." The woman didn't even glance at the papers. She smiled, wide, flat, patronizing. "That's not possible. This parcel's been designated as pending transfer. You'll need to leave until the board finalizes occupancy. There may be confusion, but trust me, we've been managing this land's future for over a year now. You'll understand once you speak with the right people." Morgan frowned. The woman wasn't asking. She was directing, assuming, steamrolling. "I have legal ownership," Morgan said, this time firmer, holding the document slightly higher. "It was gifted to me. I'm not here to argue, but I'm not leaving either." There was a beat of silence as the woman, unmoved, raised her sunglasses just slightly to make eye contact for the first time. "You'll want to be careful with that tone. The HOA takes unauthorized use of its properties very seriously. And I would know," she said, tapping the HOA badge on her chest. "I'm Karen Milton. I chair the board." Morgan, lips pressed into a line, nodded once and turned toward the house, the heat prickling the back of her neck. Karen watched her for a few seconds more before reversing the cart and disappearing down the driveway, dust trailing in her wake like the start of a storm. The following morning, the sky above the ranch was a washed-out pale blue, the kind of color that bled into the horizon without urgency. Morgan stood barefoot on the porch with a tin mug of coffee cooling in her hand, watching the breeze comb through the tall grass. The house still smelled of dust and dry wood, but she'd slept surprisingly well. There was a quietness to the land, a kind of solitude that didn't feel heavy or oppressive, but rather intact, like stepping into a room that hadn't been disturbed in years. She had made a list the night before. Check the condition of the greenhouse, look for the waterline markers, and begin mapping where the soil was still fertile enough to plant. It would be slow work, but she hadn't come expecting ease. The path to meaningful things rarely started that way. She set her mug down on the windowsill and headed across the gravel path toward the greenhouse, brushing aside overgrown branches as she went. But when she reached the structure, its curved frame still visible through ivy and rusted fencing, she stopped dead in her tracks. The doors were chained shut. Not just chained, but secured with a brand-new commercial-grade padlock and a plastic tag hanging from the handle that read, "Do not enter, pending environmental review." Attached below was a laminated sheet bearing the emblem of the HOA and a brief note citing possible soil contamination concerns. Morgan's brow furrowed. This wasn't a state agency notice, nor was there any indication of legal jurisdiction, just a vague and oddly theatrical warning. She crouched beside the door, examining the ground. There was no evidence of testing, no flagged markers, no disturbed earth, no signs of recent sampling. It was performative, a visible boundary meant to assert control. The lock was a message. She turned to look around the property. The road back toward the entrance was empty, but she could still see faint tire tracks in the gravel near the greenhouse gate. Someone had been here. She pulled out her phone and began searching the local HOA bylaws, trying to find anything referencing environmental restrictions or authority over outlying green structures, but found nothing conclusive. The parcel, as defined in her deed, was privately owned and not listed as part of any protected communal zone. She opened the deed file again, scrolling to the legal land description. Everything was intact. She was on solid ground. By mid-afternoon, she had made 3 phone calls, to the county land records office, to the environmental department, and to a property attorney she'd worked with years ago during her first grant project. Each confirmed what she already suspected. No testing had been ordered, and no agency had flagged the area. The warning notice was completely unofficial. As the sun dipped lower, she drove into town to buy bolt cutters. But when she returned and approached the greenhouse again, the laminated sign was gone. Only the lock remained. The change was subtle, but deliberate. They were watching. They were trying to provoke a reaction, but not one they could document. She didn't touch the lock. Not yet. She photographed it, took notes, then retreated to the porch with her laptop and began to search public HOA records for any mentions of her parcel. Buried in a PDF from 3 years ago, hidden within the minutes of an annual meeting, she found something. Parcel number 47 was described as non-participatory but subject to future reevaluation upon change of occupancy. There was no elaboration, no decision vote, just a single note attributed to a discussion initiated by someone listed only as K. Milton Morgan sat back and stared at the screen. They had flagged the land long ago, anticipating that it would one day be available. Evelyn, her mentor, had lived quietly, never attending neighborhood events or inviting interest. She had been a perfect buffer, someone the HOA had likely written off as eccentric but harmless. But now that she was gone, the gloves had come off. The following morning, Morgan returned from the hardware store to find a slip of paper tucked beneath the windshield wiper of her car. Printed, not handwritten. Unregistered vehicles must be declared within HOA limits. Non-compliance may result in towing at owner's expense. She glanced around. The only visible car in the area was hers. The ranch had no immediate neighbors within a quarter mile. The message wasn't about vehicles. It was another move in the slow chess game Karen seemed determined to play. By now, it was clear that this wasn't about some misunderstanding. Karen knew exactly who she was. She knew Morgan had a deed, knew she had legal access, and yet she continued to act like the ranch still belonged to her, or more precisely, to whatever vision she had concocted over the last few years. Later that week, Morgan received a letter in a cream-colored envelope with the HOA letterhead stamped elegantly in raised ink. It had the hollow, professional tone of a legal warning dressed in civility. Dear Ms. Read, It began, "We would like to formally remind you that continued presence on the property known as parcel number 47 remains subject to review. While your documentation has been noted, the HOA board must convene to determine the status of said parcel's designation. Until such time, we respectfully request a hold on all development, planting, and public engagement activities." The audacity stunned her. There was no mention of legal standing, no citation of specific laws or ordinances, just a condescending implication that her presence was premature, inconvenient, unwelcome. What struck Morgan most was the language, not confrontational, but passive-aggressive in a way that relied on exhaustion rather than force. They didn't want to battle in court. They wanted her to give up, to tire of the paperwork, the ambiguity, the resistance, and walk away. They were counting on her silence. But what they didn't know, what Karen had perhaps never imagined, was that Morgan had spent most of her adult life in systems designed to subtly edge people like her out, non-confrontational women who refused to play by unwritten rules. She'd fought for lab space, grant funding, equal credit. She'd been nudged out of conferences, had her proposals lost in review, watched as colleagues dismissed her work as too focused or too niche. But she was still here, still standing, and she had no intention of giving ground, especially not on land that had been entrusted to her by someone who had believed in her when no one else did. She filed the letter carefully, took photographs of the car notice, and began documenting every interaction in a digital log. She returned to the greenhouse and began clearing the surrounding brush with hand tools. Nothing mechanized, nothing intrusive, nothing they could claim as development. Just quiet, deliberate stewardship. As she worked, she saw the golf cart pass again in the distance. Karen didn't stop this time. She didn't wave, but she lingered long enough to send a clear message. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The first true sign that things were escalating came quietly. So quietly, in fact, that Morgan nearly missed it altogether. She had spent most of the morning behind the house, trimming back overgrowth along the fencing that separated the property from the bordering dry creek bed. The work was repetitive but soothing, a physical antidote to the relentless mental weight of legal ambiguity and polite threats. She was beginning to find a rhythm in the land, to feel the subtle shift in the wind patterns, to notice how the light changed across the field throughout the day. There was something sacred in that kind of observation, in becoming part of a place's breath instead of trying to control it. She'd nearly forgotten to check the mail. The mailbox, a rusted relic at the far edge of the driveway, rarely held anything, usually just flyers from the town hardware store or unreadable photocopies from local churches. But today there was a small envelope with no return address and a vaguely official font. The paper inside was thin, almost translucent. It was a notice from the county permitting office. According to their records, a complaint had been filed about the property. Unauthorized land use, improper zoning adherence, and failure to register a change of ownership within a community development zone. Morgan read it 3 times. None of it made sense. The property was clearly delineated as private, the deed was legally transferred and registered through the county recorder, and there was no such designation of community development in the parcel zoning classification. But someone had filed it, and that someone had cited the HOA as the complainant. She called the number on the form and was met with the bland, half-interested voice of a government employee who seemed to have only vague awareness of the form's purpose. "We received it through the online intake," the woman said. "It's flagged for preliminary review, but it's nothing serious unless the complainant provides additional evidence. Probably just procedural." Morgan thanked her and hung up, but the knot in her stomach tightened. Procedural or not, someone had officially introduced the possibility that her presence on the land was invalid. This was no longer informal pressure. This was strategic. The following afternoon, as she returned from picking up lumber to reinforce the greenhouse's front supports, She noticed a cluster of small white flags staked sporadically along the eastern edge of the property. They hadn't been there when she left. Each flag was marked with a number and a bright red logo of a landscaping company she didn't recognize. When she called the number printed on the stake, a man with a clipped voice answered and, upon hearing her inquiry, quickly told her that he was contracted by the HOA for preliminary soil grading and site surveying, and that access had been pre-cleared through community management. Morgan interrupted him, calmly but firmly. "This is private property," she said. "No access has been granted. I'm the sole owner, and I haven't authorized any external work." There was a pause. Then, "We were told otherwise. If there's an issue, I suggest you bring it up with the HOA." He hung up without another word. Morgan stood staring at the flags. They cut across the land like stitches, forming a perimeter that had nothing to do with actual property lines. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was the beginning of a claim. She removed the flags one by one and placed them in a neat stack on the porch beside the front door. Then she took photographs of the disturbed soil and opened her laptop. It was time to begin assembling her response. She spent the next several hours drafting a formal letter, citing her deed, county zoning designations, and recorded boundaries, and sent it to the HOA's central office email, copying in both the zoning office and a local real estate attorney she'd found with experience in boundary disputes. She didn't expect a response, but she wanted to draw a line in the sand. The line didn't hold long. 3 days later, she was preparing to drive into town for supplies when she found her car boxed in by a truck parked at the edge of the driveway. The driver stood leaning against the hood, arms crossed, a clipboard in hand. He looked like the kind of man who wore his uniform even when off duty, corporate polished, mildly bored, and entirely too comfortable on someone else's land. "Ms. Reed," he called as she approached. "Inspection notice, Homeowners Association, compliance evaluation. We just need access to exterior structures to verify alignment with neighborhood aesthetic standards." Morgan kept walking until she stood between him and the truck. "You don't have jurisdiction here," she said. "This isn't HOA property. I'm not a member, and this isn't a common development zone." He handed her a form with vague legal citations and gestured toward the greenhouse. "Just need to confirm it meets structural safety codes. We're happy to walk you through the process." "No," she replied. "Leave the property. Immediately." He didn't argue. He didn't apologize. He simply got back in the truck and drove away. There were no threats, no warnings, just quiet insinuation. That night, she noticed the porch light flickering despite having changed the bulb a week prior. When she checked the box, the bulb was fine, but the wiring was damp. The next morning, one of the water spigots had been left running. A slow trickle, barely noticeable but enough to flood the part of the garden bed she'd started clearing. And then came the flyers. Dozens of them. Tucked into the cracks of the front gate, stuffed into the mailbox, even left under her windshield wiper. Promotional material for a planned community expansion by the HOA, featuring sleek renderings of modern homes, shared bike, trails, and communal spaces, with parcel number 47 subtly but unmistakably erased from the map. In its place, Future Development Zone. She gathered them into a single bag and threw them onto her kitchen table. Her hands trembled, not with fear, but with restrained fury. They were rewriting her presence out of the landscape before the ink had dried. It was no longer about her deed, her plans, or even her legitimacy. It was about erasure, disguised as vision, and behind all of it, always was Karen. She hadn't returned since their first encounter, but Morgan could feel her, like a splinter under the skin, watching, waiting, pulling strings without ever appearing to touch them. This wasn't a dispute. It was a quiet siege, and Morgan, stubborn as ever, refused to retreat. She printed every flyer, scanned every document, saved every voicemail. And then, in the soft light of that evening, She walked the entire perimeter of the land with her phone flashlight in hand, placing her own markers into the soil, small flags in deep green, labeled only with coordinates and initials. E.K. It wasn't just about defending her right to be there. It was about making Evelyn's memory visible again, inch by inch, before someone else erased it completely. The next turning point came not with another knock at the door, not through more plastic flags or passive-aggressive flyers, but in the stillness of a warm Tuesday afternoon when Morgan, tired of reacting to every external provocation, decided to take back control of the narrative in the only way she knew how, through meticulous documentation, research, and exposure of the truth that was slowly starting to reveal itself between the lines of official statements and silent pressures. She had been sifting through Evelyn's old filing cabinet, the one tucked away in the back room of the ranch house with warped drawers and a faint scent of cedar and thyme, hoping to find old property surveys or perhaps a copy of any correspondence. Evelyn might have had with the local council or with anyone from the HOA. Most of the drawers contained expected remnants, botanical sketches, annotated maps of native plant clusters across the property, several field journals marked with Evelyn's brisk shorthand that only Morgan could interpret after years of exposure. But wedged in the very back of the lowest drawer, beneath a pile of seed catalogs and brittle carbon copies of soil reports, she found an envelope marked "Not for HOA. Do not discard." It was addressed to Evelyn but never mailed, and the handwriting was unfamiliar. Inside, there was a 5-page letter, unsigned and slightly smudged from age, outlining an informal offer from someone claiming to represent a development initiative working in tandem with members of the residential council. The letter referenced a projected proposal to acquire underused land parcels along the perimeter of the HOA district to unify them into a community infrastructure improvement plan. The language was intentionally vague, bureaucratic, yet evasive, but the intention was unmistakable. This was the earliest whisper of a campaign to absorb independent properties like Evelyn's into a wider plan, piece by piece, through manufactured technicalities and administrative fatigue. What startled Morgan most wasn't the content of the letter, but the attached copy of a land study, included within it, a map of the entire district with boundary overlays, including parcel number 47, shaded in a pale gray labeled Pending Annexation. Consideration. The letter was dated 6 years prior, long before Evelyn's health declined, and long before any open claim to the land had ever been made. They'd been circling for years. Morgan scanned the document, cataloged the file, and attached it to the folder she'd begun compiling. But it was the handwritten post-it, presumably written by Evelyn herself and stuck to the corner of the map, that struck her hardest. They think silence is agreement. As if time gives them permission. It was the most defiant sentence Evelyn had ever put to paper. That night, Morgan didn't sleep. She went through every email thread with the HOA, every piece of mail, every photograph she had taken, and began building a timeline. She included annotated maps, links to property law citations, scanned evidence of irregular behavior by the HOA, and witness notes detailing unauthorized entry and flagging. The document swelled past 30 pages. It was not an emotional outcry. It was an academic report dressed as a warning shot. She titled the file simply, Parcel 47, Record of Pressure and Interference. Then she emailed it to every member of the HOA board whose address she could find, copied the County Planning Commission, and blind copied a civil liberties land use organization based out of Austin. She attached a short message. You have been operating under the assumption that silence equals complicity. This is a formal record of all correspondence and interference directed toward my property. From this point forward, any further action will be considered a continuation of harassment. I suggest you read the documentation carefully before proceeding. The email sparked no immediate reply, but something shifted the next day. Around noon, as she worked near the edge of the property clearing a path through the wild thistle that had overrun the lower edge of the garden, a car she didn't recognize rolled slowly down the drive. It wasn't the usual white HOA SUV or Karen's preening golf cart. It was a practical gray sedan, old but well-maintained. A tall man in his 50s stepped out, dressed in work clothes that were just a little too clean. He introduced himself as Nolan Bryce, claiming to be a land use consultant recently brought in to resolve several overlapping claims of misregistered parcels in the district. He was affable, polite, and extremely deliberate in his wording. He didn't ask for access to the land. Instead, he asked her what she intended to do with the property long term. Morgan offered a carefully measured answer, explaining the educational and conservation mission she had drafted, the academic roots of her project, and the legal clarity of her ownership. He nodded frequently, took notes, and smiled the way someone does when they're performing reassurance. Then, mid-sentence, he let something slip. There's been talk of redistricting at the neighborhood level, just preliminary, of course, but your parcel sits in a very transitional zone. That tends to raise questions. He said it as if the issue were geographic, not political. Morgan cut him off. I've read the original HOA bylaws. I've read the zoning maps. There's no precedent for redrawing boundaries without a full property vote, and this land was never included in any subdivision documentation to begin with. What questions exactly are being raised, and by whom? Nolan offered her the thin smile of a man who's used to walking out of rooms unchallenged. Nothing that can't be clarified with cooperation. I'm simply here to advise and to suggest a path forward that doesn't involve unnecessary conflict. She didn't respond. He left within 10 minutes, but not before offering her a business card with nothing but a phone number and the name of his consulting firm, an LLC that, upon later inspection, had no website, no office address, and no contact email. Morgan sat on the porch after he left, her skin prickling not from fear, but from the awareness that this was now a coordinated effort involving people outside the board. It wasn't just Karen. It was a system. A quiet one, informal, unofficial, but real nonetheless. The next week brought no visitors, but the silence was loaded. When she went into town, she noticed subtle shifts. Store clerks suddenly less talkative, the post office attendant avoiding eye contact, a cashier at the hardware store mumbling something about too much drama out on the edge. Karen hadn't needed to wage war. She simply whispered enough to let the environment tilt against Morgan. Isolation wasn't about locking someone up. It was about making every door a little harder to open. But Morgan didn't retreat. Instead, she expanded. She submitted an official application to the State Environmental Agency to register the ranch as an independent conservation teaching site. She uploaded her project outline to the university department Evelyn once chaired, tagging it with a memorial dedication. She hired a local land surveyor to remap the boundaries with high-resolution drones and publish the images as a public online exhibit, framing them as a tribute to native flora preservation. Every step she took was lawful, quiet, and visible. Karen finally resurfaced. Not in person, but in a newsletter circulated to the HOA members. In it, she wrote a lengthy community reflection piece about the importance of cooperative land use, the risks of unregulated development, and the need for cohesion in the face of individualistic disruption. She never mentioned Morgan by name. She didn't have to. Everyone knew. But this time, Karen had overplayed her hand. The newsletter was so dripping with euphemisms and veiled moralizing that it drew attention. 2 residents reached out to Morgan, not to join her side, not yet, but to ask quiet, neutral questions. Was she really planning to build an apartment complex as the letter implied? Had she really ignored environmental flags? She answered each question calmly, sending links, documentation, and photos. No emotional appeals, just facts. A week later, the same residents emailed her again, not just to apologize, but to offer her scanned copies of HOA meeting notes they'd been given access to. In those notes were mentions of her land dating back almost a decade, long before Evelyn's name had even appeared on the HOA radar. It was no longer a personal dispute. It was institutional memory in motion, entitlement disguised as planning. The war wasn't just for her land. It was for the right to decide whose vision counted. Morgan didn't celebrate. She didn't gloat. She sat with the realization and let it settle, understanding now that Evelyn had known this fight would come eventually. That's why she left the ranch to her, not just because she trusted Morgan to protect it, but because she knew Morgan was the kind of person who didn't back away when the world tried to quietly erase her existence. She wasn't here to be liked. She was here to remain. It began again, not with a direct attack, but with the reappearance of something Morgan had thought she'd already neutralized. Language. Specifically, a new notice, folded twice and slipped under the old gate on the south side of the property, printed on the same cream-colored stationery the HOA favored, complete with the association's emblem in faded gold. But this time, it wasn't a generic advisory or passive-aggressive guideline. It was labeled as a preliminary action alert, and it came with an attachment, a printed excerpt from a subsection of municipal ordinance pertaining to permitted agricultural use within protected watershed zones. The message implied, though never explicitly stated, that Morgan's greenhouse operation, her soil testing, and even her seasonal plantings might fall under non-compliant environmental impact activity unless formally approved by the HOA Oversight Board. The message had no signature, only the word Compliance Chair, where a name should have been. Morgan read it twice, then again, slower, tracing each word like a needle through fabric. It was cleverly written, just vague enough to sow doubt, but just official-looking enough to make someone unfamiliar with property law hesitate. She wasn't unfamiliar, but she knew the tactic. Manufacture a sense of obligation, then exploit it through a process the other side controls entirely. 2 days later, she discovered that her rain catchment system, installed discreetly along the backside of the greenhouse to collect runoff into sealed barrels, had been dismantled. Not destroyed, but carefully disassembled. The pieces were stacked neatly against the wall, as if in mock courtesy. No locks were broken, no gates were forced. Whoever had done it had either known the place well or taken their time. There were no footprints, no camera footage. Just absence, silence, and that careful, infuriating neatness that defined everything the HOA touched. Morgan didn't report it. She knew how it would look. Instead, she went to town, purchased new locking mechanisms, reinstalled the system, and this time, engraved a number into each piece. 1 of 8, 2 of 8, all the way up to 8 of Entavde. She added reflective tape, labeled them as educational tools, and filed a formal registration of use with the county office under her new conservation status. It wasn't about proving anything to the HOA. It was about making a paper trail they couldn't edit. But the disruption kept escalating in a different form, through people. Neighbors she hadn't seen before began walking dogs past her property line. An older man stood on the shoulder of the road for 20 minutes one afternoon, just watching, saying nothing. One morning she woke to find her mailbox removed from its post entirely. Not damaged, just gone. She found it a day later, placed upside down beneath a tree on the western slope, half buried in clover. No note, no trace, no clear message, just enough to pull her out of rhythm, to keep her uncertain whether what she was facing was petty sabotage or coordinated exhaustion. The intent, however, remained transparent. If you can't remove her legally, make her feel unstable, make the ground itself feel unreliable beneath her feet. Then came the sudden demand from the utility board. An unexpected review of water usage, citing irregular patterns and possible violation of HOA irrigation standards. Never mind that she was not part of the HOA. Never mind that the property had its own well, clearly demarcated, historically registered, and never tied to HOA infrastructure. The notice read like a formal inquiry, asking her to provide access to internal systems for inspection and certification. Again, it wasn't a command, just a necessary step to maintain community standards and transparency. Morgan, now too experienced to be caught by the tone, responded not with argument, but with paperwork. She submitted a formal rebuttal, included well registration numbers, copies of her water rights, and politely refused access under private property regulations. But the fact that they even tried sent a clearer message than if they had threatened her outright. They were probing, searching for a weak point in her perimeter. Not the physical boundary, but the mental one. They were waiting for her to slip, to concede, to lean on their infrastructure or accept their oversight, even in something small. Because once she did, they would claim jurisdiction. The tension reached its peak one cloudless afternoon when Morgan returned from a lecture she'd given at the local college, only to find her main access road lined with temporary fencing. Not blocking it entirely, just close enough on either side to make driving through a slow, cautious ordeal. There was a laminated sign attached to one of the metal stakes, reading, "Temporary Utility Adjustment Zone. Please use alternate entry." The alternate entry, of course, did not exist. The fencing had been erected without notice. When she called the county utility department, they had no record of any project assigned to her road. When she asked for a supervisor, the clerk hesitated, then admitted that a community representative had requested temporary demarcation for planning purposes. No one from the county had installed it. Morgan hung up, drove home, and spent the rest of the day pulling the fencing out herself, piece by piece, until her hands were raw and the sun had dropped below the tree line. She left the sign propped against the old gate, a quiet invitation for whoever placed it to come and collect what was theirs. That evening, she sat by the greenhouse with a legal pad in her lap, watching the wind stir the tall grass, wondering at what point this battle had turned from obstruction into something more precise, something surgical. It wasn't about whether she belonged. It was about who had the power to decide that belonging. Karen still hadn't appeared in person, but her absence had become a presence all its own. Her name wasn't spoken anymore. Even the flyers stopped mentioning board roles or meetings. Decisions were being made behind a closed curtain now, and the audience was no longer invited. Morgan suspected that Karen had stepped back deliberately, not because she was defeated, but because she knew the damage could be done without her face on it. That was the most effective kind of control, the one that doesn't have to announce itself. So Morgan made a decision of her own. She hired a process server, not to serve anyone, not yet, but to deliver a packet of documents to the HOA office. Inside, a letter of notice for pending litigation, should any further interference occur, backed by timestamps, logs, photographic evidence, and testimonies. She included notarized statements from 2 neighbors who had grown tired of the rumors and agreed to speak in writing. She included satellite images proving that every alteration or adjustment on her land had occurred without her consent. She included receipts for every replaced tool, every rebuilt structure, every reconnected line. And at the end of it, she included Evelyn's note, the one about silence never being permission. The server returned with confirmation of delivery, and for a full week there was silence. But silence, as Morgan had learned, was never neutral. On the 8th day, the university's conservation department received an anonymous complaint claiming misuse of grant funds in the context of personal property development. No name, no detail, no evidence, just an accusation. The complaint was forwarded to Morgan out of protocol, with a bland apology and a promise of internal review. She wasn't afraid. She was furious. Because this was the shape of the war now. Not one of fences and letters, but of slow institutional erosion, of insinuation. Morgan poured herself a glass of water, sat down at the desk Evelyn had once used, and began drafting her formal response. Every word was deliberate, every sentence a rebuke dressed in calm. When she was done, she reread it once, saved it, and stared out the window into the darkening trees, wondering what it said about power that some people could only maintain it by removing others from view. She had no intention of becoming invisible. Not now. Not ever. The culmination came not with shouting or a courtroom gavel, but with the sound of distant laughter and clinking glass on a warm Saturday morning, when Morgan awoke to find that her land was no longer quiet. She stood on the porch barefoot, blinking into the sunlight, stunned to see a row of folding tables set up along the eastern edge of her property, just past the old mesquite grove. White plastic chairs surrounded them, centerpieces of fake flowers already set, and in the distance 2 people were hoisting a banner that read, Community Renewal Planning Forum, sponsored by HOA. Morgan didn't move for a full minute. Her mind struggled to process what she was seeing. No one had contacted her. No one had asked permission. And yet, here they were. Half a dozen cars parked along the perimeter, people in pastel polos and wide-brimmed hats setting up coolers and handing out flyers. On her land, as if it had always belonged to them. She crossed the field slowly, not in anger but in the controlled, almost ceremonial way someone moves when they know they are being watched. And they were watching her. A few of the attendees glanced up, recognizing her immediately, their smiles faltering into something tight and brittle. No one said a word as she passed. Near the largest table, under a white canopy, stood Karen. Perfectly composed, dressed in a crisp blouse the color of old bones, a clipboard in one hand and a thermos in the other. She didn't look surprised to see Morgan. She didn't even pretend to greet her. Instead, she gestured to one of the younger volunteers nearby and whispered something, pointing in Morgan's direction. The volunteer nodded and hurried away, presumably to fetch someone from the board. Morgan stopped just short of the canopy and spoke clearly enough for everyone around to hear. This is private property. You are trespassing. You have exactly 5 minutes to dismantle everything and leave. Karen didn't blink. The coordinates of this section fall under conditional use, she said smoothly, her voice oiled with false diplomacy. It's listed as an open access zone in preliminary HOA planning documents. You should review the boundaries again. There may have been a mistake. Morgan said nothing at first. She reached into her bag, pulled out a laminated parcel map with the GPS grid lines marked in bold ink, and held it up for everyone nearby to see. This map was verified by a state-certified surveyor. This land has never belonged to the HOA. Not now, not 10 years ago, not ever. Karen tilted her head, still unbothered, but the people behind her began to shift uncomfortably. One man stepped away from the table. Another glanced toward the cars, keys already in hand. The veneer was cracking, and then Morgan did what none of them expected. She reached into the file folder she carried and pulled out a second set of documents. This time a formal cease and desist order, signed and dated, notarized and delivered by courier 3 days prior. She handed a copy directly to Karen. "You were warned," Morgan said, her voice low but steady. "This is your final notification. Any further encroachment will result in litigation." Karen looked down at the papers and for the first time, the mask slipped. Just slightly. Her jaw tightened. Her fingers curled. But she said nothing. She turned to the crowd and spoke with the brittle brightness of someone who had just lost control of a room. "Thank you for coming, everyone. Unfortunately, due to some unforeseen scheduling confusion, we'll be relocating this meeting to a different site. Please gather your materials and make your way back to the vehicles." It was not graceful. People began leaving in small groups, some muttering apologies, others refusing to meet Morgan's eyes. In less than 10 minutes, the tables were half collapsed, the chairs stacked haphazardly, and the banner was being shoved into a plastic tote. Morgan stood motionless, arms crossed, watching them go without speaking. Karen was the last to leave. She lingered at the edge of the gravel path, staring back at Morgan with something colder than hatred, something closer to disbelief, as if she couldn't understand how this had happened, as if the rules of her world had stopped working. Then, without a word, she turned and stepped off the property. Morgan waited until the last car disappeared behind the tree line before walking back to the house, her legs trembling slightly beneath her. Not from fear or rage, but from the magnitude of it, of what it meant to push back, not with drama or spectacle, but with boundaries held and enforced in silence. That evening, as the light faded and the ranch returned to its familiar quiet, she sat at the table with a glass of water and opened her laptop. An email had arrived from the university, a copy of the internal review's conclusion. The anonymous complaint had been dismissed, the project formally cleared of all suspicion. The department chair's message ended with a quiet nod of solidarity. "We've seen this kind of pressure before. Keep going. You're not alone." Morgan closed the laptop and let out a long breath, not of relief, but of readiness. She knew Karen would retreat into shadow now, nursing the humiliation, waiting for another angle. But Morgan also knew something fundamental had changed. She was no longer the intruder on someone else's story. She was the line in the ground they could not cross. In the weeks that followed the aborted community forum, the land settled into a strange kind of stillness, as though it were exhaling after holding its breath too long. No new notices appeared under the gate, no mysterious flags showed up in the soil, and the steady procession of strangers with clipboards vanished as suddenly as it had begun. The quiet was not trustful. Not yet, but it was no longer combative either. Karen herself disappeared from sight altogether. Word traveled in fragments. She had stepped down from her post as HOA chair, citing health concerns and the stress of prolonged disputes. Others suggested she had been pressured to resign after several board members received copies of Morgan's meticulously documented timeline of interference. Whatever the truth, her absence shifted the balance. Without Karen's presence, the HOA retreated, folding into routine matters of lawn maintenance and pool schedules, no longer stretching itself into battles it could not win. Morgan did not celebrate. She had no appetite for triumph. Instead, she threw herself into the work Evelyn had always dreamed of, renovating the greenhouse, replanting the beds with carefully chosen native species, and opening the ranch gates once a month to visiting students from the university. They came shyly at first, notebooks in hand, but soon the ranch began to hum with the sound of questions, laughter, and the rustle of field guides turning in the breeze. What had been a battlefield weeks earlier was becoming, slowly but unmistakably, a sanctuary. On the porch, the stack of flyers and notices remained, stored in a weatherproof box like artifacts of a war she refused to forget. She would not discard them, but she would not let them rule her either. They were simply part of the record, proof that silence was not complicity, that erasure could be resisted if one stood long enough in the open. One evening, as dusk folded over the fields and the glass panes of the greenhouse glowed with the last traces of sunlight, Morgan sat on the porch with Evelyn's journals spread across the table. She read again the familiar line scribbled in the margins. "They think silence is agreement." She closed the book gently, her eyes lifting toward the land that stretched before her, whole and intact, and felt the weight of that inheritance settle into something lighter, steadier. This was no longer about holding ground against those who sought to consume it. It was about giving the ground back its voice, ensuring that the story written here was one of resilience, memory, and growth. And in that quiet, she finally allowed herself to believe that she had not just defended a piece of land, but claimed a future on it.